Okay, let's take a situation like this where there's a limp and we decide to ISO that person with ace-jack, and we end up getting everybody to call, which of course is not really what we wanted when we were isolating, but it does happen from time to time, and it's important that we know how to dig ourselves out when we do catch these really multi-way pots. So we end up bricking, catch three checks to us, and we're deciding what we want to do. So at this point I would classify my hand somewhere between a bluff and a semi-bluff. I might have a little bit of equity, but do I expect to get three people to fold enough of the time here? Probably not a tremendous amount, especially with things like flush draws and straight draws very present. So in this situation, I'm probably just going to say forget it and check behinds. As a default, I don't do a lot of bluff c-betting in multi-way pots. With two players, so in a three-way pot, I'm a little bit more likely to be aggressive, but especially once we start getting to four or more way pots, usually just going to say forget it and be pretty tight and straightforward. Usually if you just kind of cut out your bad c-bets in really multi-way pots, you're probably going to fare a ton better. So in this situation, we catch a flush draw on the turn, face a bet, and at this point, a lot of people would call here for one reason or another, thinking that they can draw or they have their ace live sometimes and they can draw sometimes. But in this situation, this is just a totally standard fold. You don't have enough equity to continue. There's no reason for you to continue here. You don't have a hand. So there's really nothing wrong with just folding here. Don't feel like you need to call every single flush draw or every single flush draw and some equity out the back door. Again, if it's a great spot, you're getting an excellent price, fine. But again, as a default, be tight, stay out of trouble. It's a multi-way pot. You just bricked the flop and you didn't pick up enough extra on the turn to justify getting involved. So there's nothing wrong with just folding the turn bet and moving onwards. Alright, let's take a spot where we call an early position raise with eights, end up going heads up to it, and end up catching a set and facing a c-bet. So my exact play here is really based on who early position is. Now, as a pure default, I have a value hand. I'm only beaten by a set of nines here. So I definitely have a value hand if I think that second best hands can and will continue, and in this situation, most people are going to take over pairs too far. So this is a situation where, yes, I probably definitely have value. So when I have value, my default thought process is let's get my stack inside and let's create the most amount of value possible, especially when I have things like sets or nut straights, nut flushes, all that sort of fun stuff. So in this particular situation, as a default, I want to raise here, want to start getting my stack inside, getting the big pot going, and go from there. But again, if I had other information, it would very easily change my ideas. So if I thought that early position didn't have enough stuff here that would stack off, say I thought that he would bet fold aces in this situation, well, I would just call eights, but I would raise all of my air because he's just someone who's folding too much, so it's creating a massive profit for me. So that would be something. If early position is the kind of guy that doesn't have a very strong range here, he has a very wide range, very aggressive, c-bets all of it, and he's very barrely. So that's the way I'm going to generate the most amount of value from him. Well, then I might just call here, call turn, raise riv. So it really depends on who he is, what I think he's capable of, how betty I think he is. As a default, like I said, I'm probably just going to be raising here strictly for value. But if I have other information, it's definitely going to influence my line and what I decide to do on this flop. And another reason why I like raising this flop is because, let's say I thought that he had a decent amount of things like overpairs in his range. I really don't love when I call here and then, God forbid, let a crappy turn card come off, say like an ace, which slows down his tens through kings, or a king, which slows down his tens through queens. So I'm always being very cognizant of future texture, and also how is he going to react if I call here and say a seven of hearts hits the turn, or even a jack of hearts. So I'm always very aware of what the future cards are going to be, especially just the next street. So in this situation, what the turn would be and how that would influence his action. And then, again, just making the most ideal and optimal line from there. As a default, going to be raising with intentions of stacking off. So in this situation, if he 3-bets, I'm just going to jam. And if this were someone who was very barrely, obviously that would change my flop play. But like I said, as a default, very comfortable stacking this off. Just make sure you're thinking about who early position is, how he's going to make mistakes, and also thinking about future card texture and how that's going to change your EV, how that's going to change how you get paid, if at all. Alright, let's take a situation where there is a steal, and we decide to call a king-queen suited, end up catching this, we check, and face a c-bet. So I want to talk about two different situations here. I want to talk about this one, but I also want to talk about another one first. Let's say instead of the king of spades, we're dealing with, I don't know, two of hearts. Doesn't really matter. Just a non-king or queen. So in this situation where we brick it, what I'm usually doing is playing decently tight in this situation, and as a default, not giving a lot of action. My hand is somewhere between a bluff and a semi-bluff. Ranges are a little bit wider, so it increases the chances that cutoff could have hit something that he's sort of comfortable with, or even that he'll bet call with something like ace high. So I'm not really in a situation where I want to do a tremendous amount of check raise bluffing. I surely don't really want to do a lot of check call and then try to play out the riv. That's kind of awkward. So as a default, there's nothing really that wrong with playing a little tighter when you decide to call the steal with these kind of double Broadway hands that are strong enough to do so with. So just remember that, yes, it's not balanced. Yes, you are exploitable. No, it doesn't really matter, because chances are you're not playing with opponents that are good enough to even know what the heck that means. And even if they are, most of the time they don't even know how to formulate a strategy around it. So in a situation like this, I'm not really worried about playing a little bit too quote-unquote fit or fold and kind of just check folding when I miss, because there's just so much extra value the times that I call this kind of hand preflop and do end up catching the top pair like we did in this particular situation. So when I do catch top pair, I'm kind of in a situation where I'm between value and showdown value. So I'm just asking myself, okay, what do I want to do? I have my three options. I can call, I can fold, I can raise. Well, I'm not going to fold. So I'm between call and raise. Does a check raise really accomplish anything? Is my opponent really going to make enough second best mistakes? It's kind of up for debate. Whereas if I check call here, puts myself more into a showdown value mode, which I agree with. And it allows me to kind of check call here, possibly let him barrel turns, possibly let him make mistakes where maybe he checks behind turn and then calls riv a little lighter. So it definitely does a lot of stuff going into this kind of showdown value mode, and I still made two decent streets of value. I can't really be upset about that. So in this particular spot, I'm not really expecting or even trying to get my stack inside with something like top pair second kicker most of the time. Most of the time I'm in more of a showdown value mode where, yes, I'm still trying to get value, but I'm really not trying to get my entire stack inside most of the time. So if you kind of take that mentality with top pair, especially in single raise pots, usually you're going to fare a lot better. So usually my mental mindset with top pair in a single raise pot is kind of aiming for a small to medium sized pot. Rarely am I ever going to be looking for a home run, especially when I'm cold calling it pre-flop. So in this particular spot, I really like the post-flop line. And again, the way that I play the flop is dependent on what I hit and also who my opponent is. If, say, instead of him checking behind the turn, he had bet that turn, well, I'm just going to make a decision from there. If I think that he's bluffing enough of the time, okay, obviously calling it. If I think that he is really only going to be betting that turn with, say, ace-king or better, ace-king sets, that sort of stuff, well, I can probably fold it, but you need some information before you start doing that. As a default, I'd probably check call flop, check call turn, and then check feel riv. And it does depend on my game. It does depend on his aggression levels. If he's super nitty, much easier to fold, especially in the turn. But again, these are the kind of questions you want to be asking yourself, kind of thought process you want to have. And again, as a default, there's nothing wrong with being a little fair fold in this situation post-flop, just strictly because your opponent's probably aren't good enough to be able to exploit you, and it doesn't really matter. And it's just a situation where you generate so much value the times you hit most of the time that it counteracts your fit or foldness.